Okay, so, beating chaos on substance, the CAPK. This is an outline of the presentation. We're going to talk, if you are in my lab and you've already seen this presentation, this is new, it's different, it looks the same, but we'll do different things and we'll look at different examples, and we'll talk about slightly different set of things. Some of it will look the same, but the sort of like example work will be different, and I think you'll still get something out. Okay, so first, okay, here is my premise / argument about the CAPK, based off of two observations. One is that when you are reading a KF, or when you are reading a K, solvency is really challenging to describe. It's very difficult to describe how to solve a structure of violence that persists like across, like the world, and that, pervades like everything that we do. Yes? Specifically, it is harder to win solvency than it is to win something like, here is a theory that can accurately describe some set of violence. Does anybody disagree with either of these two premises? Okay, therefore, we should read a critique that sets the threshold for affirmative victory at winning that their solvency is effective at resolving their harms. You should set a threshold that makes it hard for plays on the nature of what is challenging about K debate. And you should not read a critique that sets a threshold for affirmative victory at winning their theory of power can describe a set of violence. So when we are reading the CAPK, in other words, you should read the CAPK as a critique of solvency, i.e. your method is bad, here's an example of how and why, and not as a K of their theorization. Why would you do that? It is so hard to articulate an impact to you have theorized something wrong. It is so challenging. It is so much easier to say, you said we should, do this thing. Here's an example of when that has gone wrong. Does this make sense, like as a basic premise? Okay. Okay. So, with that in mind, backdrop about what is capitalism and why the CAPK. If you're in my lab, this will look familiar. Sorry. Okay. So, when we think about capitalism, capitalism is a system of production. It's a way of organizing society economically. This has effects that ripple outside of that. So, oftentimes, we will see charts that look like this from Marxists. And they look like, here is the economic sort of base of production. Here's the way that the economy is organized. And out of that flows a set of, attendant, cultural, political, educational, effects. And in turn, those then reinforce that economic base. Like you live in a capitalist society, so you go to school where you learn that you have to go to work to live, so that you go to work. I think that conceptualizing the CAPK like this in debate is unhelpful, and instead, credits to Tessa Harper for this chart. She made a fantastic chart. I love the chart, and this is a good one. Instead, we should conceptualize the flow of power like this. So there is still that economic base of society, right? Like there's nothing wrong with that. That base shapes a superstructure of broad, cultural norms, educational norms. It gives us a context where we exist, and then out of that is produced a subject, right? Like you cannot isolate yourself from the environment in which you are raised, which in turn is produced by an economic system structured by capital. And the most important thing about this chart is that the direction of power flows from the base to the superstructure, like all the culture and stuff, to the subject, to you as a person. The thing that conceptualizing power like this lets us do is easily identify that most affirmatives want to start at the level of the subject. KFs want to be like, hey, let's change how we think. As people, let's think a little differently. And then certainly that must change the world. And the answer is that it's in fact much more complicated than that. And starting here is swimming upstream is attempting to swim upstream of all of this sort of structure of power. Because many people have thought differently in history and been like, you know what, maybe this capitalism thing isn't so good. In fact, many people probably wake up and they're like, I don't want to go to work today. I think it would suck. In fact, I think that I should start a commune in the woods. But what happens? It doesn't work because changing your mindset cannot change the culture in which you exist, nor the political economy out of which that is produced. So this, keeping in mind this chart will help us to identify a set of problems with the affirmative, with various affirmatives, in other words, links to affirmatives. Okay, the second piece of this is, what is historical materialism? Historical materialism is a historical science, a science of history that is concerned with how economic developments have driven changes in history. So if you are interested in history or whatever, you might really enjoy the CapK. And the sort of insight that historical materialism gives us is that history is driven by tension and antagonism between conflicting forces in the world. But this has really important political implications. We must work to understand how history has been moved so that we might in turn move history. We should draw on history and historical examples for predicting the success or failure of particular strategies. And this also might give us a context to understand why, when Affs are like, let's just change how we research, or let's just change how we think, that is sort of ineffective. Because history is not made under conditions of our choosing, which is to say everything that has ever happened or is currently happening, the political situation in the status quo in any sense of the word, police brutality, like ICE just kidnapping people off the street, genocide in Gaza, economic precarity, climate change, huge rise in trans-antagonism, Trump. Those did not just fall out of a coconut tree, and our strategies for resolving them cannot either. Some people would laugh at that, but you all are not laughers, I guess. I think that's funny. They exist in the context of everything that came before them. And this is debate useful too, because I think the most important debate insight from this, besides you should think about historical examples and draw parallels to history, is the meta for answering the CapK is not good, because the CapK is not good right now. But the meta for answering the CapK is to claim things like, your K can't explain our social system, because that is a social system that came before capital on the timeline of the world. But things do not work like that, right? They become entangled with one another. And so regardless of whether or not a particular social system emerged prior to capitalism, that social system has become entangled with capital because capital takes up those divisions to intensify them, to accelerate its own process of production. So when somebody's like, but patriarchy, it happened before capitalism, therefore your CapK cannot solve patriarchy, we might have a response to that, and that might be to elaborate how those things become entangled. And I mean, the second problem with that is perhaps that we can't rewind the clock, right? Okay, so much more sort of immediately relevant things. The link debate. So how are you, the link debate is how you win. Okay, when you are reading the CapK, your goal is to do the following three things. Isolate the praxis that the affirmative has proposed. Describe why that praxis is not just failed, but counterproductive to a revolutionary project. And then articulate what socialists would do instead, perhaps to solve the same things, or a similar set of them. Okay. Does this make sense? Okay. All right, so more specifically, when we are describing why it is counterproductive, what might we do? We might impact turn something central to the affirmative in the spirit of comradely critique. Criticism is not a castigation, is not a, screw you for all the things you've done horribly. It is a refinement of praxis. If a strategy is ineffective or counterproductive, you are not being really mean to them when you tell them that, actually. In fact, that process of refinement of revolutionary strategies is kind of low-key central to organizing. If you are like in a mutual aid group in your city, or if you're like doing political organizing, if you go to like a YDSA meeting, when we talk about what to do, when we are in meetings, it's like, well, remember last time we did that, or like, hey, I have a comrade, in Chicago who tried that, and that wasn't super effective there for these reasons, right? So you want to embody that sort of ethos when you are reading the CACK, and not an ethos, importantly, and we might return to this later, of like, extinction's really big, and it's bigger than your thing. That has nothing to do with anything, and it's not helpful either. 2, solvency is offense. So like, remember like my original premise that solvency is really, really hard for chaos to speak on, because it is really easy to identify big problems in the world, and it is really hard to stop them. So we should do our best to articulate our gripes to the app at the level of solvency, because then that sets a threshold for them to have to talk a bunch about their solvency and explain how it works, which is super hard to do. 3rd is to think at the, a scope and a scale of the global. So what would happen if everyone did this thing that they are suggesting we might do? Because it might be really hard to say, hey, this is bad if you just did it, but let's think about like, what if we did this in different contexts? How would it work? And finally, that examples, and tying this to historical examples, makes casting a negative ballot very easy. Because it is much easier for your brain to latch onto a concrete example of like, okay, I know this thing will fail because some other thing very similar to it did, than it is to latch onto a broad theoretical explanation for why something might fail. Where do we get the links from? Okay, so we have said that we are going to critique their praxis. We should therefore look for what is the advocacy statement? What is the app saying we should do? And we should look at the sentence they put before the tag of their solvency advocate, and see what words they're using to describe the thing. What are they saying we should do? Another place to look could be in their solvency advocate. Maybe they mention particular organizations or groups in that solvency advocate, and they're like, all of these people did this thing before. Maybe we could take issue with what happened when those people did it. Or, and this is so underutilized, we could give a 1AC cross-ex that is like 3 minutes of asking details about the method. This is like an extraordinarily difficult cross-ex to answer. Like, I have read chaos for like, I don't know, like maybe 7 years, and I would struggle mightily to answer a cross-ex that would be 3 minutes of what do you do, how, who does it, when. If you were at Asia's debating the case lecture, this who, what, when, where, how thing, very useful. Yeah, shout out Asia. So you should ask a series of cross-ex questions about like, what are examples of your thing? How did it go? When you get those examples of the thing, you should be Googling them, like what happened? I don't know, try to dig up dirt on that. Okay. Where should we not be making links to? Anywhere other than the thing that they have said we should do, but in particular, the way they have theorized or thought about or tried to explain structures of power. This is my premise. It is so easy for them to say, the way I have explained this structure can accurately capture some set of violences. It is much, much, much more difficult for them to be like, we solved this thing because. So please do not set a threshold for the affirmative at, the affirmative wins if they have one that they can accurately describe their thing. One thing that is irksome in particular, that people love to make links to, is you said that it was about gender, or you said that it was about race, but actually the world is structured by class. No, don't do this, please, don't do this. Like, delete these cards from your files. They open the door for the affirmative to garner a ton of offense. They make it impossible for you to explain what the alternative does instead, and they do not take issue with the affirmative's praxis. It is not good. It is not good to make these links. Some concepts for links. We could say that the affirmative's praxis is committed to a local form of resistance in the face of a global problem, which means that capitalism will inevitably run circles around it, burn out organizers in the process, and produce more violence. We could say that the affirmative is an ad hoc and reactionary method that it assembles in times of crisis, but does not plan or build infrastructure during times of relative stability, which means that all we're doing is running around putting out fires and and sort of like attending individual protests in response to particular things, when really that foregoes the opportunity to build the infrastructure that would make another world possible and stop those fires from being lit by capital in the first place. We could say that the affirmative is committed to a horizontal form of organizing and refuses a vertical one. This only works if they're like, no verticalism, it's evil and fascist to do hierarchies. And that lets violence proliferate in the party and go unchecked, whereas an organized, disciplined, and vertically structured party is necessary to coordinate resistance. We could say that the affirmative requires people to be resilient and to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and to simply garner the energy to survive another day, which produces burnout and worse conditions for the things they want to solve. We could say that the affirmative capitulates to reformism and ultimately folds itself back into compromises with capital. We could say that the affirmative's ethos of "but nothing can be done" abdicates our responsibility to act, and therefore makes the structures of violence they attempt to critique inevitable. What's up?
Could you explain the resilience link a bit more?
We're actually going to look at an example of that.
Okay.
Would that be helpful? Okay. Okay. There are certainly others. What's up? Do you have a question?
Is it melancholia ones like cool optimism, like them describing we can't do anything simply it's happening again, like self-fulfilling prophecy?
Exactly, yeah. So the concept of melancholia link would be like, when we start from the perspective that nothing can be done, nothing gets done. But we all have a responsibility to believe that another world is possible and to act on that belief. Okay. The step-by-step of the links. Okay, the first thing that you want to do when you are looking at affirmative is to identify what they are advocating. What did they say we should do? Really breaking it down here, but what I'm saying is find the equivalent of the plain text in the app. Oftentimes this will be near the bottom of the app. Oftentimes it will start with some kind of verb. It's like we affirm this thing, or like we endorse this thing, or like vote for this thing. It will typically be attached to a card. It might say words that you don't recognize. I promise that it's not that complicated, and you should be able to find this. Okay. Second, pull quotes from that card that say what they do that you are going to take issue with, or from the tag of the card, or from 1AC cross-ex about the method. When you ask cross-ex questions like who does this and how, you should write down the answer so that you can quote them in the 2&C. Then, draw a parallel between the thing that the affirmative has said that we should do, the thing you're quoting them about, and a historical example of when that thing has happened, or what that thing might look like if it were to happen. Explain what went wrong, and then identify why the app is just like that thing, that example. Fourth, identify impacts. 1 to 2 impacts. Give them names. Extrapolate on what those impacts would look like. What would they do? How would they implicate the app's method? How would they implicate their ability to resolve this kind of form of violence they've identified? And then explain what the alternative might do instead. Okay. This is my own personal hot take. I really don't think that you need a card that is specific to the app. I just don't. Because very few authors and cards are going to be doing all of this stuff. I think that instead it would behoove you to simply explain it. You can develop a, in your CAT-K file, maybe develop a set of examples or sort of like boxes of links. Maybe along the lines of like the link ideas that I had before. Maybe you can think of other ones. Maybe you come up with like a favorite set of examples. Maybe you like watch a bunch of debates on YouTube and you're like, this is a great example, I'm gonna steal it. But examples are going to be, examples are like cards, right? Judges will reference them in their RFDs, but they are much faster to read and they are much more efficient at doing the thing you want them to do. Okay, an example of a link. Shout out to Kansas HW. This was a debate. I did not have cards. I went to the round. They said the one I see is new. I said okay. So I did not have that much time to prep this. This is possible to do without prep and without research. Okay. So then they sent the one I see. The app is like, we affirm polyrhythmic breathing as a way of weathering climates. Okay. They are going to breathe. And there's something about the rhythm of the breathing. And that's important because they have said that polyrhythmic breathing is a way of weathering climates. Okay. Sure. I don't have a card about that. Who has a card about that? I would be shocked if any of you did. I don't. But I do the CapK. I do the CapK a lot. I cut a lot of CapK cards. I don't have a card about that. I have a big CapK file. Nothing to say on that. So I threw in some generic card. I don't care what it said. Maybe something about localism. I don't know. I don't remember because it was irrelevant. Okay, here was my 2NC link block. The first thing that I did is I identified a top-level gripe with polyrhythmic breathing. They have said that breathing is good because it will change our state of mind. So, what is my problem with that? I'm going to summarize it in one sentence. Kansas' solvency is predicated on stopping the state of mind of unbreathability, which locates the source of violence as individual people's state of mind. Now I'm going to say some impacts. That causes burnout and collapses resistance. Okay. If we remember like the chart, like the flow chart, it's like what's the direction of power? They wanted to start all the way at the top and be like, let's change individual subjects. But those subjects do in fact exist in a context. And so lots of people maybe have changed how they breathe before, but maybe that hasn't worked very well. Okay. This is an inefficiency. I should not have said this, whatever. It was a new app, I didn't have practice on this 2NC. This was an inefficiency, it should not have been said. It's fine. It's just a little rhetorical question. It's a stupid waste of 15 seconds. Okay. Then I quoted them twice. The 1AC piece of evidence, I went through and I read it. Like, they sent the 1AC, I went for their solvency advocate and I, F12'd it, I cleared that solvency advocate and I was like, how do I know that it is true that their solvency is predicated on this? Well, it says so. And then I did a sort of, maybe plausible, but definitely not favorable characterization of what they said. I said, when I see is the logic of free your mind and the rest will follow that produces violence. And I quoted them, because they have indeed claimed this. And then, I quoted 1AC cross-X, because in cross-X, I was asking them 3 minutes of questions about it. 1AC cross-X, they say the app is, quote, an individualistic attachment to breathing, I mistyped it, through the shitstorm. This is a quote from them, so I'm happy. I feel as though the judge will understand that in fact this is something that the app has done, because I've quoted them twice about it. Okay. So we've made solvency into offense. Okay. And then I'm unpacking what this means. So, like, what would this look like if we did it in another context? What would this look like at a different scope and scale? So, breathing through the shitstorm requires people to be resilient enough to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and put themselves in a better state of mind. Now, I'm going to put this in a different context. In a debate, it might sound really cool. But during a heat wave, if somebody's like, hey, just breathe about it, you're not going to feel very good because the air is too hot to breathe. Right? Like, we're just putting the APS method in a different context. Okay. So solvency is offense, we're making solvency an offense, and we're articulating something different, scope and scale. Then, identify a series of impacts to the link. And look at this. If you're in my lab, look at how nice those bumper stickers are. One word bumper stickers. I know the judge is flowing those. Okay. 2 impacts. 1, infiltration. Okay, so what would happen? So now I'm going to draw on some examples. For example, anybody could claim that they changed their mind and that they can breathe differently. So what is an example that I can remember of this? Do we remember that like white liberals in 2016 were like, we are now the Underground Railroad, and we're going to wear safety pins about it? That was like extraordinarily cringe and bad. Because then they voted for Hillary, who campaigned on a rhetoric of anti-blackness. So I'm now comparing the affirmatives, we should just change our minds, to here are some other people who thought that they should just change their minds, and what happened to them. Okay, the second impact. So this is like an impact of like, bad people do bad things with the app. The second impact, I said two, burnout. Reactionary politics drains energy. So what will happen to the people who need to be helped by the app? Okay, now I'm going to draw another parallel. Changing minds might teach us to write to the CEOs of armed companies who sell bombs used in Palestine and tell the CEOs that they're actually contributing to genocide, to inform them so that they might change their minds. But it is not, the problem is not that they need to change their minds, because they already know that, and they actually do not care. That proves that changing minds is a bad place to invest our time and energy, and we will get burnt out if we spend all of our time trying to do so. Okay. So we've done like almost all the things. Oh no. Oh yeah, okay. I gave some examples. Perfect. Okay. Now I'm going to say the alt solves the thing. I had this card. And I did not have to go cut this card during the round. I had this card, and I maybe used a heat wave example because I knew I had this card. Right? I knew I could be like, oh, the alt solves this thing. Okay, so here is a description of what socialists would do instead. They would redistribute access to livable temperatures. This card is like, during the heat wave, socialists would guarantee housing for all and retrofit every house and living, a place to live with air conditioning for free. And well, that is being retrofitted. Socialists would set up 24/7 cooling stations in every single neighborhood. Okay. Any questions on like how we might go about constructing a link? I didn't need to read this card. You can do this without a card. You can simply describe it. Okay, yeah?
Can I see the three parts again?
Yes.
Can't see some.
You're talking about...
The like solvency offense too is like scope and scale.
Yeah.
What is scope and scale again? Like, how is it different than like just reading into the factors?
You want to place the affirmative at a different scope and scale than what they've identified. So like what would happen if we took all of this thing they've advocated for, this school year, and we threw it to a different context? So like what would it do in that context? Okay. Okay. Where is it? Okay. One thing that people are really, really worried about is the perm, usually. People are like, wait, but how does this beat the perm? How do I beat the F does something good? How do I go for no perms in a method debate? My answer to that is that when you impact turn the thing they have said, you're like, your thing is bad. The thing you have advocated for is undesirable and counterproductive. What is their left to permute? Are they going to combine their ineffective and counterproductive thing with yours? That would make no sense. So, if you are following the steps of like, I'm going to go to their solvency advocate, I'm going to say that the thing they did was bad, you're already way ahead on the perm debate. Second, you should, when you're writing your links, use the mental filter of, I need to write links that beat the perm and not just the F. So, it would probably be a waste of time to write an app that's like, or to write a link that's like, the app fails because it doesn't do our cool thing that the alt does do. That does not pass the test of do the app and also your cool thing, which is the thing that the perm is designed to test. So you cannot merely say, the app fails because it's not communism, but like the alternatives that we do communism. That is not a very productive way to critique an affirmative. Third is that you should use some framing about it. So the most effective permutations against the CAPK are going to be ones that are like, you know, you said that the aff would be bad if we did it out there or in some other context or at a different scope and scale, but we don't care about that. We can do your thing on that scale. We should just do our aff in debate. And so you should introduce a framing that is like, debate should not be purely about what we should do in debate. Instead, we should use debate as a sort of testing ground for revolutionary strategies about capitalism, because those things ultimately control access to debate. So debate does not simply exist isolated from the context of the world. For example, like debate camp costs like $7,000. I'm sure like all of you like know people who like weren't able to attend camp because it costs like $7,000, right? Like all of these are ways that like access to debate is filtered through some aspect of capitalism, right? Programs being shut down, defunded, the Chicago UDL like got their budget cut a bunch. All of these things are a reflection of that, like ultimately if our end goal is like we should do something cool in debate, that is a form of, that is a political vision that simply cannot account for itself, which is to say like capitalism makes the end of debate inevitable, right? So we should use our time here to attempt to do something about it. This is the frame. You can say the words no perms in a method debate. This will be much less. This will get you much less far than simply being like the thing you said we should do. It is bad actually. Let's just say that, right? Because then the permutation will combine that with our thing. Okay. The alternative. Okay. First, returning to like the premise, I've said that we should take issue with the affirmative at the level of solvency, and not at the level of how they theorized. Therefore, the primary sort of like aspect of the alternative should be a description of solvency and not a description of how we might theorize otherwise. So remember that the goal is to articulate what socialists would do instead. Okay. I think that this is nearly the only part of the critique where it is, you know, worthwhile to sit and cut a bunch of cards. Here's a bunch of sources. You probably can't low-key see them. I mean, like, maybe I can have Jake send this presentation out to y'all. But there's like a bunch of lefty organizations in the United States. Many of them have like news, and globally, many of them have like news organizations. You should, the card that we looked at in the example was cut from this. You should go to their news organizations and they'll typically be like, we did this cool thing. I think if you cut a bunch of cards that are like, you know, socialists do all these cool things. Very brief cards. You can tag them on at the end of each link and be like, here's our thing, we do it instead. Okay. I think that you should avoid naming a specific party or a specific organization, because that gives you a lot less control over describing the question of tactics and strategy, which is the thing you should attempt to forefront. So I think that many times, you know, people are like, affirm the Communist Party, or like affirm the PSL or whatever. The problem is that those organizations have a really, really long history and often have made missteps and done a lot of violence in that history in a way that is much more complex than debate has the capacity to reflect on, or in a way that's much more complex than like the structure of debate lends itself to discussing, essentially. So people will be like, the PSL, it is super evil, they did all this violence. And then you'll be like, oh man, I guess I lose because I said that we should do the PSL. When in reality, the history of those things extend far beyond like what we can say in a debate about them. Okay. The other thing you should avoid is being like, we should theorize about it. Please, God, do not say like the alternative is historical materialism. And so what if instead of saying the alternative is historical materialism, we did historical materialism in debates? Okay. The affirmative will have 5 answers to the CAC-K, or answers that will fit in 5 categories. The first will be like, you are, you know, like say like I don't know, like you're cis, or like you're not a woman, or something like that, or like you're white. Therefore, we know that the party knows bad things, and we do not trust you. The second is our thing first. It's a prerequisite organizing. Kansas went for this. They went for you have to read before you can organize. Third, the Holtz theory is wrong. It cannot grasp this thing or event or structure or set of violences that could not be explained purely by economic motives. Fourth is this should be a debate about what we do in debate, not a debate about what we do outside. And they'll sort of assert that that's irrelevant / not mutually exclusive. And the fifth is they might start taking issue with like when you invoke these examples, that is a thing that we have said is bad. We have a theory of power that explains why it might be bad to invoke examples in that way. Therefore, your performance is linked to our app. Okay, and they will claim that each of these justify the permutation. All of these arguments are answerable with 3 things. 1, a link that impact turns the thing they said that we should do. And that proves that the sort of issue they've identified links to them too. For example, number 1, they'll be like, well, when, for example, we organize with white people, that produces, you know, forms of racialized violence. If we identify a problem with the way that the app has described organizing, and we say that produces racialized violence, vis-a-vis the link debate, now that is not a thing that the affirmative can resolve. Then you should say, you describe how or why your alternative mitigates or solves the thing that they have said you do badly. And third is like just generally being kind of normal about it. Like if you are performing in a way that is not, you know, embodying a spirit of comradely critique, and instead you want to go in and be like, well, screw your racialized violence, I think extinction outweighs it. You have lost yourself a debate, and it is not a very good way to interact with other human beings, to be honest. So, be a normal person about it, and attempt to sort of extend some empathy in the way that you are describing the critique, because the things that they are saying are often things that are important to them, and they ought to be treated with care, which is why we should do our best to articulate how we might go about resolving those things. When they say that their thing is a prerequisite to organizing, we should say that their thing is counterproductive and stops organizing from happening. Here's what the alternative does instead of that thing. When they say that our theory cannot grasp some particular thing that cannot be explained by economic motives, we should first we should not attempt to use that to explain economic motives. We should be like, who cares about whether or not something could theoretically explain something else? This is a debate about strategy and what we should do instead. When they say this is a debate about debate, we should do the framing stuff that I talked about above. When they say that our use of examples or impacts or whatever links to our app, you should do your best to mitigate that by not being like, the impact is extinction and outweighs your thing, which means your thing doesn't matter. And then you should defend the thing you've done and say, it is actually good to look at history. Okay. Stop this nonsense. Okay. I don't know if I expanded this or not from when we talked about this in lab. Your nonsense is the following. 1, extinction stuff. Can anybody tell me, does anybody want to try to stand up for why we might say extinction in the onesie as opposed to just like, capitalism produces forms of accelerating structural violence, like why we might want to go for the word extinction? Anybody want to try to stand up for that? Yeah?
Maybe like a presumption argument, like if they say something like racialized violence leads to extinction, then you could also go for a DA and say presumption.
Has anybody ever heard of chaos say racialized violence leads to extinction? Okay, yeah, you have? Okay. What is the advantage to saying extinction than yourself as opposed to simply identifying that the affirmative is counterproductive and resolving it, and that the alternative would solve it better.
We just didn't have to represent.
Fair enough. Heard. I think that I have not heard terribly many, if any, cases where Affs are like the impact to our KF is extinction. And if they are, that puts a lot of pressure on their solvency, because now they got to solve something like that. Okay. It is my contention that perhaps saying extinction is one of the things that affirmatives are most prepared to answer, because most people read the Cap K like extinction. So most teams will have 2AC cards that are like scapegoating dissad. You said that, I don't know, like when training people get together and do politics for ourselves, that like the world ends. That sounds kind of messed up. And those judges find those to be compelling. Okay. Second, please stop the aforementioned you said class, or you said race, but it's actually class. Please don't do this. It doesn't make any sense. It is not a way of analyzing from a Marxist point of view, because it takes class to be an identity, which is like structurally not how it is, and because it is simply not true. Because of the history of things like colonialism and imperialism and anti-blackness, class and race are deeply, deeply intertwined. Do you have a question?
Do you think you can still make root cause claims?
The reason why I would avoid making root cause claims, or why I would never try to phrase them that way, is because it sounds like the thing you're describing is the affirmative has theorized wrong, but you could get all the benefits of that by simply saying, here's a link to your method, the impact of the link turns the app. It makes your thing inevitable. That sounds much better than being like, but there's a root cause. Okay, the third is over-reliance on cards at the link level. Like, maybe this is a hot take, because I don't like cards in debate typically. I really don't think that like you need to go cut a card for an app in order to beat apps on the CapK. Like, I don't think you need to like have method-specific cards. I think you could have cards to general link themes, and then the block, or the 2 and C is a really good time to unpack those in the context of the app. And the fourth is like this over-focus on / fear of the permutation. Because I think that the permutation, particularly in a KVK debate, is that KVK debates, if done well, are nearly unwinnable for the affirmative, and that the permutation from the jump is a non-starter. Assuming that the negative has identified a problem with what the app does. Like, the perm is the place where judges vote when they conclude that there was not a compelling link. So when we're losing on the perm, I would guess that most of you are actually losing on the link. The judge does not understand what the affirmative has done that is bad, and therefore they're like, yeah, I don't see the problem with combining them. Okay. Are there any other things? No, that's it. Okay, so we can do questions, and yeah, I'll start. Questions? Yeah.
I was like, what's the response to like let's say that like the chaos, like a cycle like chaos, like when they say like we like prereq your like capitalism because we utilize the desires and like that type of argument. Like I don't know what my argument back that would be.
This is the like breathing comes before our thing. So like let's think of a time when psychoanalysis was, well, I guess what was the affirmative saying we should do?
Like I think it's like embrace the death drive or something like that. I don't remember.
Okay. Can we think of an example collectively? Like, what might it look like to embrace a death drive? What could we say it looks like? We want to draw a parallel, yeah?
Just stop being like so overly attached to things, and like trying to start like repeating these traumatizing events that happen in life.
Yeah, like stop being obsessed with things. Like in the context of organizing, embrace the death drive to me kind of sounds like we should just accept that like we could fail, or that like failure is inevitable. So in organizing, if we're like, let's accept that failure is inevitable, what does that do to our organizing? Probably tells us that like we should stop it and it doesn't matter and it's not worthwhile anyway. Which means that the affirmative shuts down any attempt at organizing because I think it's evil and violent and not embracing the death drive. That's what I would say.
I guess like this way of thinking about the cap case of like not being very card heavy and rather just like putting lines, do you think this could also be applied to being a cap case against a policy app?
So the cap case specifically against a policy app, I would say no. I would say that this way of thinking about the K that is much more like, you know, quoting the app / like extrapolation heavy, is viable for nearly any critique except for the cap K against a policy app. And the reason why is because the thing that I've outlined, it uses the word cap K, and so does the cap K against the policy app. But I don't see terribly many things in common here at all between those two. And the cap K against the policy app functions like an impact term debate. They are going to stand up and be like, capitalism is good, here's a bunch of cards, and you must respond with cards. Whereas a K app is not going to do that. This is a K of the affirmatives organizing and solvency that proposes a different way of organizing. Other questions?
On the alternative debate, like kind of like similar to how you were mentioning, like, you should ask these questions to the app about like their solvency. How do you think you should explain the alternative solvency?
I think that you should explain it through a lens of examples. I think you should be like, our alternative organizes around like some small set of 2 to 3 principles. Like, we are democratically centrally organized, and we use like, I don't know, like political education as a tactic. Okay, and then they'll be like, what does that mean? And you should have an example of a time when it has been done in the past and be like, well, so like, you know, when this organization did it, it was able to do this really good thing. And it solved, which actually sounds like it solved your app, whatever, you know? Yeah.
I think they should like when I say that thing about like argument, they're like, but why is it here now? Like it's failed. Like why is you're also different than the past? Like what's the argument back to that?
Well, the first thing is that if you are identifying that the app has failed in the past, then I guess that is not a useful frame for the affirmative to go for, because then the judge is going to be voting against it, right? If like your alt has failed in the past and the app has failed in the past, what the hell are y'all doing here, right? Second is, I think you should embody that like revolutionary ethos and be like, what do you mean it has failed in the past? There are alternatives to this world that are being built all around us. The affirmative shuts them down, and then give some examples of organizations that are doing good things. Because to claim that totalizingly, no alternative to capitalism is possible and none such alternative exists is to deny like the work of organizations around the world. And it is probably to adopt a frame that is implicitly, like white European and sort of like, imperial core, you know what I mean, in its perspective, because it brackets out like the work of organizations globally and entire countries as well. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. First, you referencing historical examples. Are there specific books that you would recommend, or a specific way of going about that to understand historical examples?
Specific books? No, I think you should like read widely at the articles from some of the websites that I had up there. Like there are sometimes like lefty publishing companies like Verso Books, Pluto Publishing. Those are 2 good ones that put out a good number of books that will kind of give you historical context. I would also recommend that you just sort of like amass examples from your life. Like we've all lived through the past several years. Like we all remember when people on Twitter were like, I'm gonna write to the CEO of this arms company so that I could make them change their mind about like doing genocide. Or I think many of us perhaps remember like the 2016 election. People were like, yeah, let's all wear safety pins, right? Like those examples aren't things that necessarily come from books, but just like existing in the world, right? So like there are examples around you. You gotta like if you like attune yourself to them, you can keep like a document full of them. Yeah. What was your second question?
What do you think the best answer is to like the perm double bind that's like focus on the individual now? Yeah.
The perm double bind to me is like, app in debate alt outside of it, so I would answer it like that. I don't really know. Like, it is essentially a critique of in other words, it might otherwise be articulated as a critique of fiat. And so then you should use your tuple framing to explain why it is good to use debate to think about things other than purely debate for its own sake. Other questions?
Can you go in a little bit more about, like, or like elaborate on the framing, or like, cause like, I'm not really sure how to articulate like the difference between like what the app does in here versus what like we do.
So your argument is not we build a communist party starting in this room. Your argument is we should use debate to plan tactics and strategies that might be effective at organizing IRL. So when the affirmative is like, for example, like the counter memory app might be like, well, no, we didn't say that counter memory was a tactic for everyone to use all the time. We just said it was about research when we approached the topic of debating the Arctic. You might be like, well, that's a bad framing actually, because it abdicates a responsibility to use debate to think about the political conditions that control it, and also that control things like colonialism in the Arctic too, right? So does that make sense?
Do you think you could show me like a block?
Yeah. Okay. If you all go to my YouTube channel, by googling my name, there's a playlist that's called Good CAC versus KAF debates. If you watch any of the debates from this past year where I am debating, or the ones from any debate where I am debating, which would be Iowa, and then any team code with an A in it, I will do this framing at the top of the 2NC. So I would go watch some of those. Okay, we gotta wrap this up so that other people can, so that whoever's in here next can come do the elective. Any last questions? Okay, you're welcome to come find me if you have questions. Thank you guys for coming.